and thank you for joining me in Annie Stories. In today's video, I'll be reading William Hoff's fairy tale called The Adventures of Saeed. Have a listen with me to discover what perilous adventures will unfold for him. So without further ado, let us begin. The Adventures of Saeed, Part 1. At the time when Harun al-Rashid was ruler of Baghdad, there lived in Balsara a man named Benazar. He had a sufficiently large fortune to be able to live comfortably and at ease without working for a livelihood. Even when his son was born, he did not change his mode of living, for he said, "Wherefore should I wear myself out working at a trade, just so that I may be able to leave Saeed, my son, another 1,000 gold pieces if I am lucky, or 1,000 less if I am unlucky? What is enough for 2 is enough for 3, as the saying is, and if he turns out well, he shall want for nothing." And so he announced his intention of not allowing his son to become a merchant, but to care to study learned books with him, and as according to his ideas, besides learning and reverence for old age, nothing became a young man more than a knowledge of arms and a courageous disposition. He had him carefully instructed in the skillful handling of weapons and all modes of defense. And so Saeed was able to compare favorably not only with youths of his own age, but with his elders, as an excellent fighter. And as for riding and swimming, none could compete with him. When he was 18 years of age, his father sent him to Mecca to worship at the grave of the Prophet, as was customary. Before he set out, his father sent for him, praised his good conduct, gave him some good advice, and provided him with money for the journey. Then he told him the following story. "I am," said he, "a man who is above sharing the superstitions of the lower classes. It is true that I like to amuse myself by listening to stories of fairies and enchanters, but I certainly do not believe, as many of the uneducated do, that there is any truth in the suggestion that they are able to have an influence on the lives and actions of men. Your mother, however, who died 12 years ago, believed in them as firmly as she believed in the Quran. Indeed, she confided to me once, after making me promise never to divulge her words to anyone but her child, that she had been in communication with a fairy from the day of her birth. I tried to laugh her out of the idea, but I must confess, Saeed, that at your birth such strange things occurred that even I was taken by surprise. All day long there had been a thunderstorm, and the sky was so dark that it was impossible to read without a light. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was told a little son had been born to me. I hurried to your mother's apartments to see you and bless you, but I found her door closed and all her attendants standing outside it. And on my questioning them, they told me your mother had turned them all out because she wished to be alone. I knocked at the door, but in vain. It remained closed. As I stood unwillingly amongst the attendants outside your mother's door, the thunderstorm suddenly ceased, as though it had never been. And the most surprising thing about it, that although the sky was a beautiful deep blue above our dear city of Balsara, all around it lay clouds as black as night, and lightning flashed and darted around the circle of blue. Whilst I was observing this spectacle with great curiosity, the door of my wife's room flew open, but I would not allow the maids to enter, and went in alone. As I entered, my nostrils were assailed with an overpowering scent of roses, carnations, and hyacinths. Your mother laid you in my arms, and pointed out a little silver whistle, which hung suspended from your neck by a gold chain, as fine as silk. "The beneficent fairy of whom I told you once has been here," said she, "and has given your son this present." Perhaps she was the witch who made the weather fine and left behind her the scent of roses and carnations, I asked jokingly. She might have given him something better than a silver whistle. A purse of gold or a fine horse would have been more acceptable. Your mother begged me not to make fun, as fairies are easily offended and their blessings then turn to curses. So to please her, I said no more. But 6 years later, she mentioned it to me again, for in spite of her youth, she felt that she was at the point of death. She gave me the whistle and told me to give it to you when you were 20 years of age, and on no account to let you out of my sight before you were that age. There is your gift, proceeded Benazar, taking a silver whistle attached to a long gold chain from a casket. I give it to you in your 18th year, instead of your 20th, as you are starting on your travels, and before you return, I may be gathered to my fathers. I do not see any reason for your remaining another 2 years with me, as your mother wished, for you are a good, sensible young fellow, and understand how to handle weapons, as well as you are 24 years old, at least, and therefore there is no reason why you should not be declared of age today, as though you are really 20. And now depart in peace and in happiness or misfortune, from which heaven defend you. Remember your father. Said took an affectionate and touching farewell of his father, hung the chain around his neck, stuck the whistle in his girdle, swung himself upon his horse, and rode to the place from which the caravan for Mecca started. In a short time, 80 camels and a large number of riders had assembled. The caravan was in motion, and Said rode out of the gates of Balsara, his native town, which he was not to see again for a long time. The novelty of the journey and the different circumstances in which he found himself distracted his thoughts at first. But when they approached the desert and the surroundings became more desolate and barren, he had time to think of many things, especially his father's last words to him. He took out his whistle, looked at it, and placed it between his lips to judge if it had a good tone. But it gave forth no tones at all, although he blew until he nearly cracked his cheeks. Annoyed at the useless gift he had received, he tucked the whistle carelessly away again, but presently his thoughts turned to his mother's mysterious words. He had often heard of fairies, but he had never been able to ascertain that any of their neighbors in Balsara had any connections whatever with supernatural beings. The stories he had heard had always had their foundation in foreign lands and in olden times, and so he thought that fairies and such like apparitions had ceased to visit mankind or to take an interest in their destinies. But in spite of this, he could not help thinking that something very strange had happened to his mother, and he racked his brains to think what it could all mean. And thus it happened that he was so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he rode all day long without taking notice of the other travelers who sang and laughed as they journeyed on. Said was a handsome young man with bright, fearless eyes, a sweet, good-natured mouth, and although so young, he had a very dignified bearing. The stately manner in which he rode his horse, fully equipped as he was in warlike attire, drew the attention of many of the travelers upon him. One old man who rode beside him was so well pleased with him that he endeavored by drawing him into conversation to find out if his character fitted his appearance, and Said, who had been brought up to reverence age, answered politely and modestly, and withal so cleverly and prudently that the old man was delighted with him. But as Said's whole mind was concentrated on one subject, it was not long before he led up to it in conversation, and he asked the old man if he believed in fairies and such like spirits, and whether he considered they were able to have any influence over the lives of men. The old man stroked his beard and shook his head slowly. "I have frequently heard of such visions," he said, "but I cannot say that I have personally encountered any supernatural creature whatever. At the same time, I have heard of numberless cases of fairies and genii appearing to others." He then began to recount to Saeed a number of extraordinary stories that at last the young man's head was in a whirl, and he could not but believe that the strange circumstances that were supposed to have taken place at his birth were actually true, and that he was under the protection of some powerful fairy who would assist him if ever, finding himself in danger, he blew the little silver whistle. He dreamt that night of fairies, genii, castles in the air, and magic horses. But unfortunately, the next day he was disillusioned. The caravan had traveled all day at a leisurely pace, when towards evening some dark objects were observed at the most distant point in the desert. Some thought it was only another caravan approaching, but Saeed's old friend cried out to all to be prepared for an attack, for without doubt a horde of wild Arabs was approaching. The men seized their weapons, the women and merchandise were placed in the center, and all was prepared for an attack. The dark mass moved slowly across the plain, looking at the distance like a number of storks about to wing their flight to foreign lands. But as they approached nearer, they increased their pace, and very soon it was seen they were a body of men, armed with lances, who dashed forward with incredible swiftness upon the caravan. The men defended themselves bravely, but the robber force consisted of 400 men, and they surrounded the caravan on every side, attacking skillfully with their lances. At this terrible moment, Saeed, who had fought with the bravest, remembered his whistle, and placing it to his lips, blew with all his might. Alas! He let it fall again quickly, for it emitted not a sound. Enraged over this bitter disappointment, he took aim at an Arab, who by reason of his magnificent apparel was distinguished from the rest. He shot him through the heart, and the man fell from his horse, dead. "Allah, what have you done, young man?" cried the old man. "Now we are lost indeed." And so it appeared, for when the robbers saw this man fall, they uttered horrible yells, and renewed the attack so fiercely that the few men who were still unwounded were soon dispersed. Saeed was surrounded in a few moments by 5 or 6, but he wielded his lance so dexterously that no one could approach him. At length, one of them was about to dispatch him with an arrow when a comrade made a sign to him to desist, and before Saeed could determine what the new mode of attack was to be, he felt a lasso flung over his head. He made frantic efforts to free himself from it, but in vain. The cord only drew tighter and tighter. He was a prisoner. The caravan was now completely overcome. Some of the men killed, the rest captured, and as the Arabs did not all belong to one company, they divided the prisoners and booty between them, some of them journeying to the south, others towards the east. 4 armed men rode beside Saeed and regarded him with angry looks, and he felt sure that the man he had killed must have been a person of importance, probably a prince or chieftain. He felt thankful that he had incurred this special wrath, for he quite expected they were taking him to their camp to kill him, and death was preferable to slavery, which was the only other alternative. The armed men watched his every movement, and threatened him with their spears if he attempted to turn round. However, he managed to turn his head for a moment, and was delighted to see that the old man who had been his companion, and whom he had believed to be dead, was accompanying his party. At length he saw trees and tents in the distance, and as they came nearer, a number of women and children came to meet them, and scarcely had these exchanged a few words with the robbers than they broke into fearful weeping and screaming, and raising their arms towards Saeed, cursed him loudly. "This is he," they shrieked, "who has killed the great and noble Al-Mansur, the bravest of all men. This is he, and he shall die, and we will give his flesh to the jackals to devour." They pelted him with pieces of wood, clods of earth, and anything they could lay hands on, so fiercely that one of Saeed's guards was obliged to intervene. "Back, unruly ones," he cried. "Give place, you women. The man who slew the noble Al-Mansur must die. It is true, but by the hand of a brave man, not by the hand of a woman." When they reached an open space amongst the tents, they stopped. The prisoners were fastened together in couples, and the booty carried into the tents. Saeed, however, was bound alone and was led into a large tent where an old man sat. He was magnificently clothed, and his stately mien showed that he was a chief of the robber band. The men who led Saeed in approached him with sorrowful looks and bent heads. "The shrieks of the women have broken to me the news of what has occurred," he said majestically, "and your attitudes confirm it. Al-Mansur has fallen." "Al-Mansur has fallen indeed," answered the men, "but we bring him here to you, his murderer, in order that you may determine what manner of death he shall die. Shall we shoot him from a distance with our arrows, or shall we chase him down a pathway of spears, or shall we hang him, or have him torn to pieces by horses?" "Who are you?" asked Salim, the chief, glancing gloomily at the captive who stood before him, waiting courageously to meet his death. Saeed answered briefly and with truth. "Did you murder my son treacherously, attacking him with arrow or spear from the rear?" "Not so," replied Saeed. "I killed him in fair fight, and because he had slain 8 of my companions before my eyes." "Is it as he says?" demanded Salim of Saeed's guards. "Yes, it is true enough," one of them made reply. "Al-Mansur was killed in fair fight." "Then he only did the same as we would have done," replied Salim. "He killed his enemy, who would have robbed him of life and liberty. Therefore, unbind him at once." The men stared at him in surprise and began to obey him most unwillingly. "Is the murderer of your brave son to go unpunished?" one of them asked. "I would we had him killed at once instead of bringing him here." "He shall not die," cried Salim. "I claim him as my share of the booty. He shall be my servant, and I will have him in my own tent." Saeed could find no words with which to thank the old man. The men left the tent grumbling. As soon as they had communicated Salim's decision to the women and children who were waiting outside to witness Saeed's execution, there was a terrible outcry, some of them vowing to avenge Al-Mansur's death as his own father would not. The rest of the prisoners were divided amongst their capturers. Some were released in order that they might go and treat for a ransom for some of their wealthy prisoners, and some were kept as slaves and sent to tend the herds of cattle. Many, who had formerly 10 or 12 slaves to wait upon them, were now set to perform the most menial duties. But not so Saeed. Was it his brave heroic appearance which prepossessed Salim in his favor, or was it the intervention of some good fairy? There was no knowing which, but Saeed was certainly treated more like a son than a servant. But the strange affection of Salim for Saeed caused jealousy among the others. Everywhere he encountered hostile glances, and when he passed through the camp, he heard murmurings and angry words, and sometimes an arrow would whiz past his breast, and at such times he could not help thinking that the little whistle he carried must in some way protect him. If he complained to Salim, it was useless, for the whole camp seemed banded together to shield the would-be murderer and to take part against Saeed. And so one day Salim said, "I had hoped that you might have stood to me in place of my son whom you slew, but the fault lies neither with you nor me. They are all embittered against you, and I find I am unable to protect you. Of what good would it be to me after your death to punish your murderer? As soon as the men return from their present expedition, I shall say I have received the ransom money from your father, and send you away in charge of several trustworthy men." "But there is no one I can trust beside yourself," said Saeed. "They will murder me as soon as we are well on the way. I will make them take an oath to protect you that no one has ever yet broken." A few days later, the men returned to camp, and Salim kept his promise. He gave the youth weapons, a handsome robe, and a horse, summoned the fighting men, and chose 5 from them to serve as Saeed's escort, forced them to take a solemn oath that they would not kill him, and bade him farewell with tears. The 5 men rode in gloomy silence through the desert with Saeed. The young man could not fail to see how unwillingly they had executed their commission, and what troubled him also was that 2 of his escort had been present at the fight in which he had killed Al-Mansur. End of part 1. Please go to the next video for part 2.